It was the kind of day where the light filtered through the trees just perfectly, casting long shadows across the yard. The leaves had turned their brilliant autumn colors, and the wind carried the scent of impending winter. My parents' house, nestled on the outskirts of the small town where I had grown up, had always been a haven, a place of comfort. Today, it was anything but. We had planned the dinner for weeks. A family gathering, a chance for my parents to spend time with the kids, for all of us to enjoy each other's company without the rush of everyday life. My wife, Sarah, had seemed excited about it. She had helped plan the menu, had fussed over the little details. She always did that. It was one of the things I had loved about her, the way she always cared, always seemed to want to make things perfect. I had thought it was for us, for our family. But looking back now, I realize it was just a performance, another layer of the lie she had been living. The kids had been in rare form that day, full of energy, racing each other around the yard while my mother and father prepared inside. Sarah and I stood on the porch, watching them. She was smiling, but there was something in her eyes, a distant, hollow look that I didn't understand at the time. I had tried to push away the nagging feeling that something was wrong. After all, we had been together for over a decade. We had built a life together, raised two beautiful children, and shared more memories than I could count. I couldn't have imagined that anything could destroy what we had. Dinner was set, and we all gathered around the long, wooden table that had been in my family for generations. My parents, always so proud of the life they had created, smiled at each other across the table. The kids were still giggling from their outdoor games, and the smell of roast chicken filled the air. It should have been perfect. It should have felt like home. But as we settled into the meal, I couldn't shake the strange tension that seemed to hang in the air. I looked at Sarah, who was talking animatedly with my mother, her hands moving as she spoke. To anyone else, she might have seemed happy, relaxed even. But I knew her better than that. Her movements were too fast, her laugh a little too loud, her eyes darting away from mine whenever I tried to catch her gaze. I pushed the feeling aside. Maybe she was just tired. Maybe the stress of life had finally caught up to her. After all, we had been through a lot in the last year: work pressures, the challenges of raising kids, the normal ups and downs of marriage. But we had always weathered it together. That's what marriage was, right? Sticking together, even when things got tough. Halfway through dinner, there was a knock at the door. My mother, always the gracious hostess, stood up to answer it. We weren't expecting anyone, but in a small town, it wasn't unusual for neighbors to drop by unannounced. I watched as she opened the door, her warm smile fading into something I had never seen on her face before. She stood there, frozen, for what felt like an eternity. When she finally stepped back, the man standing in the doorway walked in. He was tall, rugged-looking, with the kind of face you don't forget easily. I didn't recognize him, but the way he carried himself, the way he scanned the room, made my stomach churn. He wasn't here by accident. I felt Sarah stiffen beside me. She didn't even need to look up. She knew exactly who he was. "Can I help you?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady, though every instinct in my body was telling me something terrible was about to happen. The man's eyes met mine, and there was no hesitation in his voice when he spoke. "I'm sorry to interrupt your family dinner, but I think you deserve to know the truth." He glanced at Sarah, who had gone pale, her hands shaking as she gripped the edge of the table. "I've been seeing your wife." The words hit me like a freight train. For a moment, the world stopped. Everything around me, the warm glow of the lights, the clinking of silverware, the sound of my children's laughter, became distant, muffled, like I was hearing it through a fog. I stared at the man, waiting for the punchline, waiting for someone to laugh and tell me this was all some horrible joke. But no one did. My children, still too young to fully understand, stopped what they were doing and looked at me with wide eyes, their innocent faces caught in the confusion. My parents, my father's strong, stoic face, and my mother's loving gaze, both looked at me, their expressions a mix of shock and disbelief. They had always believed in the sanctity of marriage, in the bond that Sarah and I had shared. To them, it was unimaginable that something like this could happen in our family, in their home. I turned to Sarah. She couldn't even meet my gaze. Her eyes were fixed on the table in front of her. Her lips trembling, as if she was trying to find the words to explain the unexplainable. Is it true? My voice came out hoarse, barely a whisper, but in the dead silence of the room, it felt like a shout. She didn't answer at first. She just sat there, staring down, tears forming in her eyes. The seconds stretched on, each one more excruciating than the last. Finally, she nodded, a tiny, almost imperceptible movement that sent my heart plummeting into a darkness I hadn't known existed. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, but her apology felt like a mockery. Sorry wasn't enough. Sorry wasn't going to erase what she had done. Sorry wasn't going to fix the devastation she had just unleashed on our family. My father was the first to break the silence. He stood up, his chair scraping against the floor, his face etched with disappointment, with anger. "How could you?" His voice was cold, like ice cracking under pressure. He wasn't just asking her, he was asking the universe, asking how something like this could happen in his family, in his son's life. My mother's face was a mask of grief. She looked at Sarah, then at me, and I could see the pain in her eyes, the pain of seeing her son betrayed in the most brutal way imaginable. The kids, sensing that something terrible had happened but not understanding the full extent, began to cry. My son, the older of the two, tugged at my sleeve. "Daddy, what's wrong?" His small voice, full of innocence, broke my heart in ways I didn't know were possible. I wanted to shield them from this, to protect them from the ugly truth that their mother had betrayed us all. But there was no way to do that now. The damage was done. The man, the one who had brought this storm into our lives, stood there, awkwardly shifting his weight from one foot to the other. He looked like he was about to say something else, but I couldn't take it anymore. "Get out," I said, my voice low, dangerous. "Both of you. Get out." Sarah finally looked up at me then, her face streaked with tears. She tried to speak, but I didn't want to hear it. There was nothing she could say that would change what she had done, nothing that would make this betrayal any less cruel. The man turned and left without another word. Sarah stood slowly, her eyes pleading, but I couldn't bear to look at her. I couldn't bear to see the woman I had once loved, the mother of my children, the partner I had trusted with my life, standing there, broken and ashamed. She hesitated for a moment, as if she wanted to fight, to explain, but then she turned and walked out the door, leaving me there with my children, my parents, and the wreckage of everything we had built together. For a long time, no one spoke. My mother, always the caretaker, gathered the children into her arms, comforting them, trying to shield them from the pain they didn't fully understand. My father stood in the corner, his arms crossed, his face a mask of anger and hurt. And I just sat there, staring at the empty chair where Sarah had been, trying to comprehend how everything had fallen apart so quickly, so completely. The rest of the night passed in a blur. My parents offered to take the kids for the night, giving me space to breathe, to think. I didn't argue. I needed time to figure out how to explain to them why their mother wasn't coming home. Time to figure out how to live in a world where trust had been shattered, where love had been betrayed so deeply. When the house was finally quiet, I sat alone in the dark, my mind racing. I thought about all the moments Sarah and I had shared, the day we met, our wedding, the birth of our children. I thought about the promises we had made, the future we had imagined. And then I thought about the man at the door, about the secret life she had been living, the lies she had told, and the reality I now faced. Betrayal is a strange thing. It doesn't just hurt. It changes you. It makes you question everything, every memory, every smile, every shared moment. Was any of it real? Did she ever really love me? Or was it all just a lie, a facade to cover the truth she had been hiding all along? I didn't have the answers that night. I still don't. All I knew was that the life I had believed in, the family I had cherished, was gone. And in its place was a gaping wound, one that would take a long, long time to heal, if it ever did. The days that followed were a blur of grief, confusion, and numbing pain. The world moved on around me, people went to work, children went to school, the sun rose and set as it always had. But for me, time seemed to stretch and bend in cruel ways. The hours dragged on, and yet somehow, I couldn't keep track of the days. It was as though the betrayal had opened a black hole in the center of my life, pulling everything into it, leaving me floating in the aftermath. Sarah had moved out by the end of the week. It wasn't something I had asked her to do explicitly, but after that night at my parents' house, it seemed inevitable. We couldn't live under the same roof, not with the children. Not with the weight of what she had done hanging over us. She had stayed in a hotel for the first few nights, and then, eventually, she found a small apartment nearby. Close enough to the kids, she had said. But far enough that I didn't have to see her every day. The separation was a relief in some ways, but in others, it left a gaping hole that echoed with memories of what we had once been. The kids asked about her, of course. At first, they were confused, unable to understand why their mother wasn't coming home. My son, Daniel, would stand by the window every evening, waiting for her car to pull into the driveway, his little face pressed against the glass as if he could will her back into our lives. He asked me again and again, "When is mommy coming home?" And each time, my heart broke a little more as I tried to find the right words. "She's not coming home right now, buddy," I would say, my voice calm but strained. "Mommy and daddy need some time apart. But you'll see her soon, okay?" It wasn't enough for him, and I knew it. How could it be? He was only 7, too young to understand the complexities of adult relationships, too innocent to grasp the enormity of what had happened. But he knew something was wrong. He could feel the tension in the air, the sadness that lingered in every corner of the house. My daughter, Emily, who was only 5, seemed to take it a little better. She asked about her mother, but not with the same urgency that Daniel did. In some ways, I think she was still too young to fully comprehend the changes happening around her. But she clung to me more than usual, following me from room to room, her small hand gripping mine as if she was afraid I might disappear too. I held her close every chance I got, grateful for the distraction of their needs, even as my own pain threatened to swallow me whole. The hardest part, though, was dealing with my parents. They were devastated, not just for me but for themselves as well. They had loved Sarah like a daughter, had welcomed her into our family with open arms. My mother, in particular, had always doted on her, treating her as if she were one of her own. The betrayal cut deep for them too, and though they tried to be strong for my sake, I could see the hurt in their eyes every time they came over. My father was a man of few words, stoic and composed as always, but I knew him well enough to sense the disappointment he carried. He had raised me with the belief that marriage was sacred, that family was everything. To see his son's family torn apart like this, it was a blow he hadn't expected. He didn't talk about it much, but there was a quiet sadness in the way he looked at me, as if he was mourning the future he had imagined for us, a future that would never be. One evening, about 2 weeks after Sarah had left, my father came by to help me fix the broken fence in the backyard. It was one of those small, mundane tasks that seemed to take on new meaning now. As we worked side by side, the autumn air crisp and cool around us, he finally broke the silence. "You know," he said, his voice gruff but gentle, "people make mistakes. Big ones. Sometimes. Unforgivable ones." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. I knew where this was going. My father had never been one to shy away from the hard truths, but, he continued, pausing to hammer a nail into the wood, "What happens next? That's up to you." I looked at him, confused. "What do you mean?" He set the hammer down and turned to face me, his eyes searching mine. "You have to decide how you want to live your life now. You can carry this pain with you, let it define you, let it fester. Or you can find a way to move forward. I'm not saying you have to forgive her, son. God knows, I don't think I could. But you can't let this destroy you. His words hit me hard, like a punch to the gut. I hadn't realized it until that moment, but that was exactly what I had been doing, letting the betrayal consume me. I had been walking through each day in a daze, unable to think about anything else, unable to focus on the future because I was so mired in the past. My father was right. I had a choice to make. The problem was, I didn't know how to move forward. How do you rebuild a life when everything you thought you knew has been ripped away? How do you look at your children, your family, and explain to them that the person they trusted most has betrayed them? How do you trust again when the foundation of your world has crumbled beneath you? I didn't have the answers that night, or for many nights after that. But I knew one thing, I couldn't stay in that place of anger and grief forever. I had to find a way to live again, for my kids, for myself. The road ahead was long and uncertain, but it was a road I had to walk. There was no other choice. Sarah reached out a few times in those early weeks. She wanted to talk, wanted to explain herself. At first, I ignored her calls, her texts. What was there to say? What could she possibly tell me that would make this any better? But eventually, after much prodding from my parents, I agreed to meet with her. Not because I was ready to forgive her, but because I needed answers. I needed to understand how the woman I had loved for so long could do something so devastating. We met at a small cafe downtown, Neutral Ground. It was a cold, gray day, and I remember the rain falling lightly against the windows as we sat across from each other, the silence between us thick with tension. She looked different, thinner maybe, her face drawn with guilt and sadness. But it was hard for me to see past my own pain. I don't even know where to start, she said, her voice trembling. I never meant for any of this to happen. Then why did it? I asked, my voice harsher than I intended. Why did you do this to us? To our kids? She sighed, running a hand through her hair. I don't have a good answer, honestly. I was unhappy. I didn't know how to talk to you about it. And I made a terrible mistake. The worst mistake. Unhappy. I repeated, my heart pounding in my chest. We were building a life together, Sarah. We have 2 beautiful children. How could you have been unhappy without telling me? Without giving us a chance to fix it? She looked down at her hands, tears filling her eyes. I don't know. I was scared. Scared of how you'd react. Scared of facing the truth. It doesn't excuse what I did. Nothing does. I'm so sorry. I sat back in my chair, the anger simmering just below the surface. Her words did nothing to soothe the wound she had inflicted. They didn't bring back the trust that had been shattered, didn't erase the image of that man standing in my parents' house, revealing the truth she had kept hidden. I don't know if I can ever forgive you, I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. She nodded, wiping away her tears. I understand. I don't expect you to. There was so much more I wanted to say, so much more I needed to understand, but in that moment, I realized something important. I couldn't keep living in the past. The betrayal would always be there, a scar that would never fully heal. But I couldn't let it define the rest of my life. We sat in silence for a while longer, the rain falling softly outside. Eventually, we parted ways, not as husband and wife, but as 2 people who had shared a life and were now trying to figure out what came next. It wasn't closure, not yet, but it was a step towards something new, something different. In the months that followed, life slowly began to take shape again. The kids adjusted, though there were still difficult moments. Daniel stopped waiting by the window every night, and Emily began to smile more often. My parents were a constant source of support, helping me navigate the challenges of single fatherhood, helping me rebuild the sense of family that had been fractured. As for Sarah, she remained in the kids' lives, seeing them on weekends, trying her best to be a good mother despite the distance between us. We were civil, for the sake of the children, but the intimacy we had once shared was gone, replaced by a quiet, resigned understanding that the life we had once known was over.